What's up, everybody? It's another waitingfornextyear.com podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm going to be talking to Joe Lull. And everybody loves when I talk to Joe Lull, formerly of 92.3 The Fan. And initially I reached out to Joe because I wanted to talk about Mark Shapiro and his exit from the Indians. And in the meantime, Scene Magazine released their story about how sports talk radio is dead. So just by happenstance, I'm going to be talking to Joe Lull on a day where there's something even more relevant to him than Mark Shapiro news. I had no idea that was actually going to happen. I really didn't. But it's a lucky accident, so looking forward to talking to Joe Lull. And I hope you enjoy that. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. They have over 180,000 titles. It's audiobooks. If you sign up for their free trial, it's 30 days free trial with one free audiobook download, that you're definitely going to be able to find something. I've recently listened to Adam Carolla's latest book. I really love to find podcasters who wrote books. And Adam Carolla's book is especially cool because he goes on tangents that aren't in the book because he's so natural on the radio and as a podcaster. And so, just look up Adam Carolla, make that your free download when you try out. Go to audibletrial.com/WFNY. That's audibletrial.com/WFNY. Thanks for listening, everybody. And now, here comes Joe Lull. As promised, Joe Lull is on the line. Would you believe me if I told you that I didn't know that Scene article was coming out, Joe?
I would believe you. I knew it was coming out because I got a phone call and went on the record for it. But interesting piece, huh, Craig?
Yeah, it was definitely interesting. It pointed out a few, and we're talking about in Scene Magazine. The headline said that sports talk radio is dead, which, you rightly pointed out on Twitter is pretty hyperbolic. But it goes through kind of the state of sports talk radio, and if anything, I think the article's summary is that it's somewhat passionless and maybe directionless.
I think you put it terrifically. I saw the headline, and you're talking to someone who was in the industry for about a decade and who's been out of it now for over 6 months. And do I think sports talk radio is dead? Well, absolutely not. I mean, there's 2 stations in Cleveland that do solely sports. By all accounts, they're somewhat successful financially. People listen. I talked to a few of my former coworkers and, current friends that went to the anniversary party that 92.3 had last Friday. It sounded like they had a decent turnout for that. So to say sports talk is dead, I think, makes it sound like nobody is interested in it anymore, nobody listens anymore. That's not the case. I thought, at least my interpretation of the article and reading it, and there was an awful lot in there, and, at times I thought it was a little bit disorganized, but there was a ton of material that Dan McGraw, I believe is his name, put in there. I think when you say sports talk radio is dead, I would view it more from a management and talent perspective. I think the drive and the desire is waning. That's the way I would phrase it. I think to say the medium is dead is more of a reflection on people not listening, which isn't the case. People listen. But I think the desire is, and, that burning passion to do great, indispensable radio. Not that you're going to replicate Howard Stern on Cleveland Sports Talk, but Pete Franklin, Howard Stern, Rush Limbaugh, those are the type, you say those guys, and those are personalities that listeners, regardless of the radio medium you're talking about, sports, politics, talking about strippers, people gravitated to those people because of how dynamic they were, how entertaining, engaging they were as personalities. And just my personal assessment of the industry now is I don't think there's as much investment by stations in promoting personalities or personas. Chuck Booms was the biggest personality in town, and he's out on his keister. And I know that in some ways I think they try and suppress that, because when you have a big personality that attracts people, yet helps your listenership, but that also can't be controlled. And the radio stations want to certainly have control over everything. So it's safer, Craig, to have, what I call white noise. Just, turn it on and do the formulaic stuff that article references. Well, let's air the press conferences, and let's interview Scott Petrak every Monday at 11, and let's interview Mary Kay Cabot every Tuesday at 11, regardless of what's going on in the world of sports. Very formulaic, very consistent. You know what to expect, and if that's what people want to listen to, that's their prerogative, and a lot of people are listening. But I just don't think you have that drive and desire to do great, indispensable radio anymore. I think the bar has been lowered significantly, and that's really, I think, more the point of that article, as opposed to the medium as a whole is dead.
Well, and some people will think that I'm kind of an apologist or a patsy for the talent and the management, but I blame it all on the ownership of the companies, and I blame consultants who come in and they've taken this playbook, an easy to replicate playbook, and they try and apply it across all levels of talent and in all sports markets. And they want the sports talk to be formulaic, not only from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, which is probably why Chuck Booms is out more than anything else. Budgetary and stylistically, they couldn't guarantee, if we've got these three major stories, we can't guarantee that we can keep Kiley and Booms talking about that the same way that we can keep it throughout all the different day parts. So I blame that. And I've consistently said that it makes no sense to me to hire diverse talent who are completely different people, from Booms, Kiley, Baskin, Phelps, Bull, Fox, all the way down, and try and make them all sound the same. It doesn't make any sense to me to not embrace the differences of those different personalities, but they want to apply a formula across all these varying degrees of personalities.
No, I totally agree. And that's, I think, again, it's just important to point out, it's not that the medium's dead, but it's just, I think the approach, isn't necessarily what it could be. And the other thing, I'll draw an analogy here, with the Browns, there's talk this year about, okay, we've got Josh McCown running the offense, and if Johnny Manziel is to come in, he's going to be running the exact same offense, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you have I don't want to say bland, and I don't mean this as a slight to anyone that's in the business or that I used to work with, but if you have comparable personalities across the board, it's kind of like running the same offense, whether it's your first string or second string quarterback. It's hard to replicate Chuck Booms when Chuck Booms is on vacation, or when Chuck Booms, inevitably is sick and has to take a day off, because he's a very unique talent. And I think the more cookie cutter the stations take their approach to things, the easier it is to replicate people, and the more replaceable people become, quite frankly. And we know that's in their best interest, to make sure that everyone's replaceable, which everyone is replaceable. Nobody's irreplaceable in the industry. So I guess the one thing, I was quoted in that article, and one thing that I think I've reflected on since leaving the business myself, that, my ego wouldn't allow me, Craig, to admit when I was on the radio. You're behind that microphone, and you're making a pittance, but you're telling yourself, I've got this big microphone, and people can hear me from Ashtabula to Toledo, down all the way to Mansfield and across to Canton, and I'm talking to thousands, and I'm calling myself the ombudsman, and people know who I am, and they care what I say. And the reality is, for the vast majority of listeners, now there's a small segment I will set aside that are diehards, that care about who they're listening to and take an interest in them personally, but the vast majority of people that turn on 92.3 or 850, they don't even really know who's listening or who's hosting the show. They don't really care who's hosting the show. So long as you're talking about the Browns, talking about the Indians, talking about the Cavs when they're the relevant topic in town, it's all just white noise in the background. It's like you turn on 99.5, you don't care if it's, Garth Brooks, well, I'm aging myself here, if it's Garth Brooks or Kenny Chesney or, name another country artist out there, Rascal Flatts, so long as it's country music, I'm good.
And it's the same 20 songs.
Exactly, and I think the same theory applies to sports talk, and that was something hard for me to admit. your ego tells you, oh, I've created a personality and a persona, and people care who I am and what I have to say. I think for the vast majority of listeners, again, it's all white noise in the background, and to the everyday Joe average listener, it really doesn't matter who's on the air. And I think to a great extent to the radio stations themselves, it really doesn't matter who's on the air. And that's just the reality of, where the business is today. I'm not saying it's good nor bad, but I certainly wouldn't call it dead. I think it's disappointing to some extent.
So of all the national guys or the big-time sports talkers who have become more than just the formulas that they were forced to play in, what's the playbook? I mean, that's the million-dollar question. How does the next Jim Rome become Jim Rome, or I don't know. I love Bomani Jones and his podcast, but he's doing it completely differently. He's not applying a formula. So is there a way for a local guy, any of the local guys, and I think there are a lot of capable local guys, is there a way for one of them to kind of break out of that mold and become so big that that no program director or consultant is going to stop them?
I don't know. I think the tough thing today, you look at a Jim Rome or a Colin Cowherd or some of these, great sports talkers that there are, currently, they broke out well before there was the saturation that we have now. And there is such saturation. I mean, with podcasts and with the number, how many national sports talk radio networks are there now? I mean, you've got ESPN Radio, you got Fox Sports Radio, you got Yahoo Sports Radio, you've got Bleacher Report. There's got Bleacher Report Radio. MLB has their own radio network. NBA has their own radio network. NFL Radio. There's PGA. I'm driving last week or a couple weeks ago when the PGA Championship's going on. I'm listening to the PGA Radio. They have their own radio network on Sirius XM. There is so much media now and so much saturation. Honestly, I don't know how you break through. I think I didn't get to really listen to Pete Franklin when Pete Franklin was what he was in this market. But, and I mean this no slight to the late great Pete Franklin, because he blazed trails in the sports talk industry. But I question if he got his start in 2015, would Pete Franklin end up being Pete Franklin? Because he was the only game in town back then. I think, again, not to slight his talent, but that's an element of what made him as big as he was, is he was the only one doing it.
Well, and you're right. I'm sorry. Nobody can have a first mover advantage anymore. You're right.
Right. I mean, it's just everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's some sort of sports talk, and so I don't know. It's a great question. How do you break out? I don't know how you do it. I don't know if you can. I'll use the example. Katie Nolan, immensely talented. She was on that that failure of a show that they had Regis Philbin on Fox Sports 1, and I think has done her own podcast, and now she's got the TV show with FS1 Garbage Time. I think the world of Katie Nolan. I've seen her YouTube clips and the things that she's done. I think she's brilliant, talented, young sportscaster or sports talker or whatever you want to call her. Have I seen her TV show once on FS1? No. I haven't seen one episode. Now, I think she's great. I think she's talented. I love watching her stuff. There's so much crap on TV these days and on radio, Craig, that I have never really, and this is someone who I admire. I think is terrific. I've never even seen her new TV show one time. Garbage Time. I haven't seen it once. There's that much saturation that someone I think is great, I haven't even been able to catch her show.
Well, that's really funny that you mentioned that, because I feel the same way about John Oliver. I've never seen a show, but I've watched YouTube clips of John Oliver's show 100 times at this point. And so you can put something on TV, you can put something on radio, and I think that's the thing about sports talk radio today. There are alternatives to it, whether it's podcasts or whatever else, so that people can get their little bite-sized nuggets. And that's why a lot of radio shows, even though they're broadcast for 4 hours with commercials, they kind of condense down their best bits and put them out on podcasts. And so it's smart to kind of pirate your own audience before somebody else pirates your audience. But at the same time, It makes you wonder what the future is going to look like, because and you and I talked about this in the past, just how over program. I mean, the shows are too long. So many
Well,
of the shows are too long.
Let's just call a spade a spade. If you're trying to now, if you're going to do the same hour on repeat 24 hours a day, that's one thing. That's doable. But how in the world, when you have essentially three topics, Browns, Indians, Cavs, and we both know the Indians are hard to talk about. So 2.5 topics, and I guess you mix in a little bit of Ohio State, but even the Buckeyes don't have that much of a traction as talk radio topics in Cleveland. How in the world can you do original, captivating, what's the other word I'm looking for?
Compelling.
Just really compelling. Thank you. That's where I'm looking. Compelling programming based for 18 hours a day. 18 is what the fan's on. I don't know exactly how many hours KNR is on. But how can you possibly do programming that on those 2.5, 3 topics, 18 hours a day, essentially 7 days a week, and keep it fresh, keep it up to date, keep it, non-formulaic? It's very difficult. I don't know what the answer is to it, and I totally agree. Part of the answer to it is you shorten your shows and you have more voices. Because if I hear one voice saying something, and then 2 hours later I hear a totally different voice saying the exact same thing, I'm probably not going to notice that it was the same theory being regurgitated by a second voice, because I'm hearing it from a different person. It's going to sound new to me. But when you got people on for 5 hours at a time, it tends to get stale. And I think I know from my experience doing it, it is a bear to do a 5-hour show and to keep your heart in it, to keep passion and the drive up, and to not mail it in from time to time. And I think you see that reflected sometimes. By no means, people that I know, there's a lot, Craig, since I've been following this stuff well before I got into it 10 years ago, one of the favorite pastimes of sports talk radio listeners is to bitch about sports talk radio and how bad it is. And this will never end. But, I think it's important, too, as someone who's done it, to convey how difficult it is to do. But the way things stand today, I don't know that the personalities are necessarily compelled or incentivized to try to be great. I think just being good enough is good enough. It's good enough for themselves. It's good enough for management, certainly. And it's good enough for everyday Joe fan listener who simply has sports talk on in the background as white noise.
All right, last thing before we move on from this topic to Mark Shapiro and the Indians and his exit to the Toronto Blue Jays. I want to know if you're still happy to be on the sidelines, if you're still satisfied not being in front on the air.
Yes. My handicap has gone down significantly this summer. It's been great for my golf game. I think as you may tell through, some of the comments I had earlier, you go through some introspection when you basically live your whole life saying, I'm going to be a sports talk show host. I'm going to get my own full-time show. And then you abruptly get out of it. But I haven't second-guessed it. If anything, it's been reaffirmed with some things that have happened recently. And I don't want to dive in any details, but just some things I've heard, in and around the business. So no, I don't miss it. I like I've said before, every minute that I was on the air, I enjoyed the time that I was on the air. But now that I'm not on the air, I don't miss being on the air. And it's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. People may or may not know this about me, but I've always been a big sports guy, but if anything, I'm a bigger politics guy. Right? I've got CNN, Fox News, MSNBC on my TV equally as much, day in, day out. I get in the car, I turn on Sirius, I'm listening to POTUS or Patriot or the MSNBC feed because I like to hear things from all different sides. I'm a politics junkie. And I had a buddy of mine that I was talking to the other day saying, why don't you get back into it and get into news talk and politics talk, do like what Glenn Beck does. I thought about it, that would it be fun? Yeah, but the same problems that you see with sports talk radio apply to that form of radio. They apply across the board. And you got to be honest with yourself. Why would I be doing it? Does it serve some egotistical desire just to be heard and to think that you're a big deal because you have a radio show when in all reality you're not? And that, I kind of told my friend, yeah, it might be fun, but I really don't think it would be worth it. And I think I'd rather sit on my couch and watch Bill O'Reilly at night than have to prep for a show and, do it myself.
Well, and see, this is where I think podcasting is the best of all worlds, because you really only need to do a half hour, maybe a couple times a week. That's really all you need to do to build an audience and keep that itch scratched.
And there may come a point. I am not there yet. There may come a point where I decide to do something like that. If I think the market's big enough that I could come pilfer for some of your audience, Craig, then I'm coming for you. I don't think that time is now, at least for me.
Well, I don't know if you know this about this show, but it's big enough now that we have a sponsor that we actually do a live read in the middle of it, because for the audience of this show,
Tony Rizzo?
Audible.com, you can go to audibletrial.com/WFNY. You have a free 30-day trial. You can download one free audiobook. There are a million things to choose from. I've recommended a bunch. I don't need to spend any more time on that. audibletrial.com/WFNY. And that's that. Let's talk about Mark.
I will be going to audible.com once I hang up with you. I've got to check this out. 30-day trial?
audibletrial.com/WFNY. Thanks so much, Joe. Yeah, I will. I've got
to take my golden capsules first. I've got to pop my Jobies, but then I will be going to audible.com.
Man, I wish I had Jobies as a sponsor.
On that note, do you realize how ridiculously overpriced that bee pollen is? Have you ever gone to like a CVS and buy bee pollen as a supplement and then compare it to what Joe B charges for his product? It's incredible.
I think you're ruining something, because your first name is Joe, and if you start that political podcast, you've got your first sponsor just right there.
Yeah, I already ruined it.
Take it from this Joe. Take it from this
turn
Joe.
I undermine myself. Yeah.
All right, so I reached out to you because I thought this. I just looked at the Mark Shapiro news and the Indians and I said, this screams for the Ombudsman and the old weekend show that we used to listen to, because I could just imagine what your first 20-minute segment would have been like after this news broke and it became official, because you've got the question of Mark Shapiro's legacy in Cleveland and the timing of it. Was it time? Was it too soon? Are Indians fans going to rue the day that Mark Shapiro left? And I know I just led you in 27 different directions without one specific question, so I'll start here. What was your initial reaction when you heard the rumor and then found out that he was actually going to Toronto?
I wasn't surprised another organization was interested in him, because, track record notwithstanding, on the field, I know fans don't like to listen to this, but it's the reality. The Indians organization, Mark Shapiro, Chris Antonetti in particular, have been, widely respected and highly respected around the game for a number of years. So maybe the Indians, haven't had great success in the playoffs. Well, they haven't. Maybe we haven't won a World Series. They haven't. But when it comes to the way they conduct business, the way they've aligned the organization, the way they've coached internally their people and allowed them to climb the organizational ladder, these guys are held in high regard all across the game. So I wasn't in the least bit surprised that another organization, reached out and was expressed an interest in Mark Shapiro. I guess as far as him leaving, my response to that was a shrug of the shoulders. Like, okay. I think Mark did some nice things here, but at the end of the day, the Cleveland Indians under Mark Shapiro's reign, they weren't awful, they weren't great, they were just kind of there. And they won, they made the run in 2007. They won, or got into the playoffs and lost in the wild card game to Tampa a couple years ago. And granted, he was, had a tremendous challenge when he took over for John Hart and really had to rebuild this thing from scratch. We had to suffer through Kareem Garcia and, some of the, Chris Magruder and Einar Diaz and, some of what we had to go through back in the early 2000s. It wasn't easy. The cupboard was bare, and it was up to Shapiro to kind of rebuild it. And if you remember 2005, I believe it was, the Indians were right there for the playoffs at the end, and then they completely disintegrated down the stretch. I recall them, I think they lost 6 out of 7 the final week of the year. I think it was Kansas City that beat them the final weekend of the season.
It was brutal.
Knocked them out of the playoffs. Yeah, it was just awful. So they had a near miss, and I think that was 2005. They made the big run in 2007. Then, obviously, we had the implosion in 2008 and the trading of the Cy Young Award winners and all that. But, I think Mark Shapiro did some good things. The interesting thing for me is you look at the trade record of this organization. And it's so hard, I think, to praise them or to criticize them, because everything that I see with this organization seems to just always come out as a wash. You look at the trade chart, they have made so many brilliant trades where the return has so far exceeded what they shipped out. You know, we could look at the Corey Kluber deal where they sent out a beat-up Jake Westbrook. Corey Kluber turns out to be a Cy Young Award winner. We all thought that the Cliff Lee and CC Sabathia trades were disasters. Turns out you've got an MVP candidate, Michael Brantley, an all-star in the CC deal. You end up with Carlos Carrasco, who has been tremendous this year and a part of last. You got him in the Cliff Lee deal. Yeah, it took a little while for them to develop, but those trades even turned out. So many others, the Asdrubal Cabrera trade, and I have to look up and down the list, but the vast majority of trades he made, Craig, whether it be Shapiro or Antonetti under Shapiro's leadership, they were wins for the Cleveland Indians. But unfortunately, when you couple that with some of the misses on who to sign, who not to sign, who to re-sign, who not to re-sign, and the deplorable drafting of this organization really for about 10 years, you ended up just being about an average baseball team just about every year, and that's why, Mark Shapiro's tenure, it's a shrug of the shoulders. It wasn't great, it wasn't awful, it just kind of was.
Well, first of all the trades, it always comes back to the Victor Martinez one for me, and people are groaning out there because I mention it way too often, but that's the one that always just punches me right in the gut.
Well, that was the one that they didn't really need to make because they still had Victor under contract for another year, essentially a year and a half from when they traded him. But you look at it, and whatever modest success the Indians had those couple of years, Justin Masterson, who they got in the Victor Martinez trade, he was a big part of it. So you even look at that deal, and Victor Martinez has turned out to be one hell of a hitter pretty much his entire career, but they got Justin Masterson, and for a couple seasons there, you could make the argument that Masterson was a better value than Martinez was, because Victor was hurt for a couple seasons. So I hated that deal at the time too, but even that one, Craig, I think there's some arguments to be made on behalf of the Indian side of the trade.
Maybe. I think it exported the heart and the leadership for that team, and they still haven't recovered from that until
that's a great point.
Terry Francona.
That's intangible off the field. That's a terrific point. And you're right, because Victor was the heart of that team. I remember he cried when they traded him. And what the intangible effects of that, what that did to the clubhouse, you can't really measure. So no, that's a brilliant point on your part.
The one point that you made that I keep coming back to is that you weren't surprised that there was interest from other organizations in Mark Shapiro, and I'm with you on that. But what is that? So let's take that to the next logical point. What does that indicate about people's opinions of the Indians organization, Indians ownership, and the constraints with which Mark Shapiro had to work under?
Oh, well, it is what it is. They've got, the 26th highest payroll in baseball?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this organization, I shouldn't say organization, but this situation, the Cleveland baseball situation is viewed as a tremendous challenge by the vast majority of people across Major League Baseball, as it should be. You have limited resources. Maybe once every 4 years, you could shell out for a couple big-name free agents. Now, we remember the Indians shelled out the big contract extensions to Travis Hafner, to Grady Sizemore, to Fausto Carmona back in, 2000, and even Jake Westbrook back in, I think it was about 2007. I may be off by a year or two.
Hey, whenever it was, we remember. Yeah.
Right. But they made their plunge in the free agent market by signing their own guys back then, and it turned out that those moves didn't pan out. And that money, ended up as dead money, largely. So then you kind of get to hit the reset button a couple years ago. All right, so it's our next chance to kind of clear the books and make, you're going to have around an $85 million payroll, so we can allocate, $25, $30 million of that to a couple guys, try and take another big plunge. They go out and they get Swisher and Bourne, which were defensible moves. I think most of us thought they were good moves at the time, and, those blow up in their face. So when you can't make up for your mistakes and just immediately get out the eraser and bring somebody else in when you've got to live with them for a couple of years, and it affects, like a domino effect, the rest of your what you can and can't do. It's just viewed as a very difficult situation to win in because you essentially have to be perfect. It's no different than Tampa, no different than Oakland. And I would argue that Tampa and Oakland have had pretty comparable success to the Indians. People look at it's always funny, Craig, for me in sports. We always, I think, undervalue what is accomplished here and overstate what's accomplished elsewhere.
Sure.
People look at it like, well, look what Billy Beane does with the Oakland A's. Well, have you seen the Oakland A's this year? Right, he shipped out Josh Donaldson, the soon-to-be American League MVP, to Toronto in a very questionable trade. Yeah, I mean, who knows what they got back in that deal? I think a lot of the baseball experts question the return that Beane got on that deal. Oakland hasn't been anything to speak of this season, but Indians fans don't realize that. If the Oakland A's 2 years from now are in the playoffs, then everybody's going to be saying again, look what Billy Beane does with the Oakland A's, just like we did a couple years ago. You saw it with Tampa Bay when Tampa makes a run with a low payroll. Look what Tampa can do. Why can't we do that? And I hate to break it to people, but when the Indians made the playoffs in 2013, I think the people in Oakland were probably saying, how come Cleveland can make the playoffs with a low payroll? How come we can't? It's cyclical. Shapiro said it, and it pissed a lot of people off. But if they can make a legitimate run every 4 to 5 years, based on the constraints that they have here, that's probably a realistic expectation.
Well, and if there's one crime that I think, not crime, but if there's one thing that I think Shapiro really, really miscalculated on, it was the fact that he never varied his message. He never changed his message, even when Indians fans had reasonable expectation to think that the Indians were in that competitive window and had one of the best teams in the league. He was still talking about market size. He never altered that sales pitch. And if there's one thing that I think he failed on, it was the tone and the message and the sales pitch. And in that respect, I think maybe it was time. Maybe, it had become a little bit stale for him and a little bit tired, and a change of scenery probably is good for everybody.
Absolutely. And, if Mark Shapiro was anything, I think he was remarkably consistent and honest. He was always honest with people about the situation, the constraints that they had here. I know we hate that word, but it is what it is. Constraints financially with ownership and, the lack of revenue.
But they even underperformed. They even underperformed with their constraints, I think.
I guess it's such a mixed bag. I mean, I look at what they did in 2007 and thought, geez, they could have ended up winning the World Series that year.
But then they never followed it up.
Well, right. The next year was a complete implosion. And I agree. That's a good point, because when they had the chance to take that one last step, to go one step further and really take the leap to try to be great, even if it would result in their complete implosion a year later, they didn't really take that plunge. The one instance in which they really rolled the dice was, of course, the Ubaldo Jimenez trade, when they shipped out 2 number 1 picks and Drew Pomerantz and Alex White, along with some other flotsam, and got Ubaldo Jimenez back from the Colorado Rockies. And the fascinating thing that I don't pay that close attention these days, Craig, but that I heard certainly in the last week, is that Mark Shapiro was opposed to that trade.
Yeah.
Chris Antonetti's the one who wanted to make that deal. And you know what? It didn't. Did it work out for the Indians? Well, Ubaldo was a big part of the run to the wild card game a couple years ago. You remember he had really turned things around on the second half of the season, was a totally new pitcher to the point where we were debating, I think, that off season whether or not to give Ubaldo Jimenez a big-time contract extension. He ended up taking him from Baltimore, and that's been a disaster since. But, Ubaldo was the one time that the Indians really said, to hell with it, we're going for it. And that was Chris Antonetti's doing. Mark Shapiro, I guess, internally protested the decision but allowed it to go through. And, again, the results were mixed, although certainly Pomerantz and White turned out to be nothing elsewhere. I think that was a really fascinating look into the mindset of Mark Shapiro, that even then, when the Indians were competitive and making a run for the playoffs, Antonetti's the one that kind of pushed the envelope and wanted to dare to be great. And Mark Shapiro was okay with just kind of holding serve and didn't want to risk those prospects.
It's interesting because I think for a time, Mark Shapiro was the very best possible voice for the Cleveland Indians, but dude has the fire of a CPA. And so at a certain point, I think it wore thin, and he probably stuck around. It was probably a little bit too long. And it's hard to look at things like that because you never know what the replacement's going to be like. But I guess my takeaway after thinking about this for a couple of days is if I'm faced with looking at the last 10 years of Indians results, I'm not so terrified of giving that up, even if the result is worse on a going forward basis. It's worth the risk to try and get better than that.
Yeah, and I don't know, really, let's lay it out here. Are things going to change moving forward from what they were this past off season or last trading deadline or 2 years? Not really. I mean, I think really Mark Shapiro sat in a corner office. Chris Antonetti picked his brain. Shapiro was very involved with stadium renovations and all that, but on the baseball side, did he have a tangible influence? I don't know because I'm not covering the team on a daily basis, but it certainly, to me, doesn't seem like he did. So will things really change much moving forward? I mean, hell, the organizational structure is staying just the way it is. Shapiro's job was essentially a job created out of nowhere. It was almost like Mike Holmgren's role with the Browns, where you have this traditional structure of a business side, a personnel side, both report to management, and they hash things out from there. Well, when Mike Holmgren came in, he inserted himself between the personnel people, the financial people, and the owner. He was essentially the de facto owner. You saw the same thing with Joe Banner when he took over with the Browns, that he inserted himself between Jimmy Haslam and the personnel side, the coaching side, the business side. He was that insulative layer. Well, when they created this president's role for Shapiro, that's essentially the role that he fulfilled. He was essentially the de facto owner under Paul Dolan, who was the active owner still, with kind of a repetitive position. I kind of wonder, what exactly was Mark Shapiro doing on a day-to-day basis other than walking around the offices and shaking people's hands and offering words of encouragement and a shoulder to cry on. And I don't know. I don't know how active a role he had and really what tangible effects he had on the direction of the organization baseball-wise over the course of the last couple of years since he's been in that president's role and out of the GM chair.
I always assumed he was a driving force in helping them capitalize on STO and get that thing sold for a very nice profit. And I don't know. I mean, that's what I assumed. And I assumed that those are the experiences that all of a sudden look extra attractive to other markets and other cities like Toronto, where that's the resume line, former GM, but holy cow, he was able to make hundreds of million, over $100 million for ownership on a sports network.
It's a great point, Craig, and I'll draw this analogy. I laugh to myself all the time about baseball and how funky a game it is. When you think about someone like Asdrubal Cabrera, when the Indians acquired him, he was acquired as a Gold Glove caliber shortstop who couldn't hit a lick. By the time Asdrubal Cabrera left the Indians, he was a pretty good hitter who was below average defensively. Brandon Inge came up with the Detroit Tigers as a lights-out defensive catcher who couldn't hit. And by the time Brandon Inge finished up his tenure with the Detroit Tigers, he was hitting 20 home runs a year playing third base. He wasn't even a catcher anymore. It's so funny in this game on the field how people evolve from being one thing to almost the complete opposite in the course of their career. And you look at someone in a front office capacity like Mark Shapiro. He was a personnel guy. He started out with the draft in the minor leagues, then a GM. He was a trades and free agents and contracts guy. And now, by the end of his tenure, by the time he ends up in Toronto, it's like the baseball stuff is either secondary or almost outside of the picture. Now it's all about stadium renovations and television contracts and business deals. It's like a totally different person. And it's just kind of funny because that's the game that it's taking place in is baseball, and you see that same storyline play out with actual players all the time in Major League Baseball. And now it's happening with an executive.
Well, Joe, thank you so much. You spent even more time with me than I asked for, and I totally, definitely, ultimately awesomely appreciate it. If and when you ever want to start that show and you want to build that audience, you need to do it right here. We'll create a little sports network, and you can have your freedom. You can have your 20-25 minutes a week of audience building and ego stroking, and then you can not, I was going to say sail off into the sunset, but it sounds like you're playing more golf than boating.
Yes, there's a lot more golf than boating right now. But you know what? Golf season is going to be coming to a close soon, so I'll have to find something else to do with my time. So, Craig, I appreciate it. Always good coming on with you. I'm definitely going to check out that website after I have my golden capsules here. And, yeah, we'll do it again soon, my friend.
Did you mean audibletrial.com/WFNY?
I tee it up, and you knock it out of the park.
All right, everybody. I've been doing something special, Joe, where I have all the listeners of the show do some feedback so that, because some people listen, they don't always identify themselves as listeners. This isn't a blog post with comments necessarily. So I want you to go out onto Twitter, and I want you to just say, hey, to Lull on Sports, at Lull on Sports. That's your feedback assignment. Let them know that you heard him on the waitingfornextyear.com podcast, at Lull on Sports. Go say hi. And until next time, everybody.
Craig, I took enough blows to my ego and my time on the radio, and now you're going to do this to me and encourage people to go to my Twitter account and reach out. Do I really want to see what they're going to have to say?
There are going to be dozens of people. No, yeah. I got to do something to figure out if they're out there.
If there's any question if I was going to eventually do that podcast, once I see the reaction to my appearance today, I think we'll have that answer, and it'll be a resounding no. Joe, there's no appetite whatsoever for your return.
Well, we'll find out soon enough. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. It's been the waitingfornextyear.com podcast.
Waiting for next year.